Alright, so this is going to be a video in response to a debate I recently watched. It was a debate in which Hunter Avallone argued for the existence of systemic racism, and the person he was arguing with, I thought, made a fair number of reasonable points, but they weren't approaching the issue from a very data-oriented perspective. And so I tweeted at Hunter Avallone, seeing if he wanted to debate the topic. He didn't get back to me, and so I thought rather than try to pursue that line of inquiry any further, I would just make a video explaining in some depth why literally just everything he said about racism in the debate was factually incorrect and painted a extremely distorted picture of reality. And this begins really with the way he defines systemic racism, and I'll just play a quick clip here of him doing that.
So systemic racism is defined as a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or an organization. In simple terms, systemic racism refers to a system that disproportionately negatively affects Black people. That's going to be the definition that I am using today, because that is the definition and it's a simpler explanation.
So this is obviously retarded for a number of reasons. In the first place, defining systemic racism so that it can only ever impact Black people is insane. I think he later amends that definition to also include all brown people. But of course, trying to define the concept in a way that it can't negatively impact white people is just him displaying a kind of anti-white bias that he has, probably subconsciously. And this is also very silly because you try to imagine a world in which African Americans committed murder at a higher rate than white Americans did, then the law against murder would be an example of systemic racism, and that's not how anyone has ever actually used the word. And the definition has been changed in this case in such a way that it leaves open the question of whether or not it's wrong. Right? So that murder example makes that clear, that just establishing something is systemically racist by this definition doesn't tell us anything at all about whether or not it's fair or just or moral. And what I'm going to be arguing throughout this video is that Black people are treated fairly given their behavior. And so I'm going to basically ignore this definition he gives at the beginning, but I don't actually think that's a problem because he kind of ignores this definition, or at least it doesn't come into play in any important way for most of the debate. And he goes on to just make a number of factual claims which are not even remotely supported by the relevant evidence. And this begins with certain mythologies that he peddles concerning redlining and mortgage lending and the like, and so we'll just listen to that now.
So systemic racism does not require intentionally racist laws to still be a big issue. So, for example, in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration successfully segregated neighborhoods on the basis of race, first incentivizing builders to build suburban neighborhoods with the requirement that no Black people were allowed to purchase in those communities. This forced Black people into urban housing projects, and at the same time, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, which was a policy called redlining. Maps would be color-coded with red lines to indicate risky, quote, areas to insure. Now, you might be thinking, this is a really long time ago. And yes, you'd be right. But the problem is that these discriminatory policies have a lasting effect to this day.
So the first thing to say about redlining is that given that the gap in the rate at which Black and white people own homes did not significantly widen in the 1930s or 1940s, it's kind of silly to think that a bunch of federal programs were introduced which gave home loans to white people but not Black people, in a way that significantly impacted economic development. But anyway, the idea of redlining starts with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is this organization that made these maps which demarcated risky areas. And the idea is that they marked certain areas risky because they had lots of Black people in them, and that then they would not give loans to people in those areas. Now, this is, in the case of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, definitely not true. It's been long noted that the Homeowner Loan Corporation didn't take these maps very seriously, and that they gave out loans in areas that they themselves marked as not very good. And as a matter of fact, if you look at a study on who they gave loans to in Philadelphia in the 1930s, what we find is that Black people were overrepresented among those who were given loans, and that the areas that they gave the loans in were Blacker than average. Now, what some people argue is that even if the Homeowners Loan Corporation didn't use these maps very much, the FHA used these maps, or very similar maps. Now, it is true that at least on paper, the FHA had a policy or a bias against giving out loans in mixed neighborhoods. Now, in the first place, though, we have to say that mixed neighborhoods, of course, that includes Black and white people. It's not clear why that would negatively impact Black people relative to white people. And they would give loans to people in racially homogeneous areas, whether that was Black or white. And so it's not clear how this was ever supposed to really damage Black America. And then most importantly, the empirical research that has been done, most of it many decades ago, into whether or not redlining is actually happening in the real world as opposed to just on paper somewhere, have determined that it is not. So, for instance, this paper on loans given in Pittsburgh found that the percentage of a neighborhood that was black was not significantly related to the rate at which mortgage loans were given out in that neighborhood. And another study, this time looking at data from Toledo, Ohio, found that, quote, the racial composition of a neighborhood has no significant effect on the total number of loans made in that neighborhood. They go on to say this result is consistent with the hypothesis that redlining does not exist on the basis of race. And then they go on to say that their analysis revealed no support for the hypothesis that lenders redline racially mixed neighborhoods with respect to the total number of loans transacted. We can look at another study, this time looking at Sacramento, California, and it found that once the effects of socioeconomic status variations are accounted for, measures of ethnicity or age of the housing stock contribute little explanation. And specifically what they're referring to here is explaining the level of mortgage lending that took place in a neighborhood. Now, it is of course true that poorer neighborhoods have a harder time getting home loans, but that's because people in poorer neighborhoods have a harder time paying back loans. And it is true that black people tend to disproportionately be poor, but it would be insane and stupid to call a system racist just because the people giving out loans don't ignore the actual risk of giving a black person a loan and give it to them at the exact same rate that they would give it to white people just because they're black. Now, importantly, the research that I've cited up till now was all done before 1977, and in 1977, the Community Reinvestment Act was passed by some people who bought into this redline narrative, even though, as we've seen, it's not corresponding to reality. The Community Reinvestment Act set up a system whereby banks are given points for doing things like facilitating capital investments in poor communities, providing support to minority or woman-owned financial institutions and low-income credit unions, giving out loans in low-income communities, etc. Banks will periodically go under an evaluation period, and they're given points based on how well they meet these different criteria. And if they don't meet them sufficiently well, the government will not let them do things like move their office to another place or buy another institution. And the result of this push by people like Hunter, but 50 years ago, was to cause bad loans to be given out. So we see here from a 2012 paper which found that if you look at the loans that banks give out around the time that they're being evaluated, well, A, they give out more loans in that time period, and B, the default rate for those loans is significantly higher than you would expect. And so long ago, these false narratives about redlining already compelled lawmakers to make it so that businesses will lose some of their basic rights if they do not give loans to the kind of communities that people like Hunter say they don't give loans to. And that has created a situation in which the banks have given out such loans even though the loans are not economically rational. And so not only is it the case that the redlining narrative does not justify a belief in any kind of systemic racism against black people, but that in fact, the modern situation, if anything, justifies a belief that there is not sufficient bias against certain neighborhoods because the government is artificially lowering that bias below what economic rationality would dictate. He goes on to tie this false narrative about redlining into a story about accumulating wealth differences through generations. So let's take a quick listen to that.
According to the Brookings Institute, for the last 2 generations, we see higher starting poverty rates, lower upward mobility rates, and higher downward mobility rates for black people. The higher rates of poverty among black people is almost entirely a result of redlining. Americans generate wealth using their home equity, but for decades, blacks were restricted from growing generational wealth due to redlining. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago, redlining had pernicious and damaging effects. Without bank loans and insurance, redlined areas lacked the capital essential for investment and redevelopment. As a result, suburban areas received preference for residential investment at the expense of poor and minority neighborhoods in cities like Chicago. So after this policy was finally done away with, it was unfortunately too late. Black people lost out on a huge chance to grow wealth to pass down to their children, and since the suburban homes increased in value over the decades, black people were no longer able to afford the nicer homes, leading to significantly less upward mobility compared to their white counterparts. This is still impacting black people today. Brookings Institute again explains that at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family in 2016. Gaps in wealth between black and white households reveal the effects of accumulated inequality and discrimination, as well as differences in power and opportunity that can be traced back to this nation's inception.
So I think there are 2 broad things to say about this. In the first place, it's obviously stupid to say that redlining accounts for the overwhelming majority of why it is that black people are poor. Black people were poor well before redlining. Moving on from that, though, there's a really kind of misleading thinking going on here about the way that wealth accumulates in families over time to begin with. And to understand that, I just want to talk a bit about intergenerational wealth. And we can start with this study looking at intergenerational wealth over about a 30-year period. And what it found is that a doubling of the net wealth of grandparents predicted a 60% increase in the net wealth of white grandchildren, but a doubling of black grandparents' net wealth only predicted a 9% increase in their grandchildren's wealth. We see a similar result from this study, again finding that the relationship, in this case over a single generation, so now we're just talking about parental wealth and offspring wealth, that this relationship is extremely weak among African Americans, so that their family having a lot of money doesn't translate into the future generations having much money. Now, you might try to explain that by saying something like, oh, well, they can't get a loan. We've already, gone over why that isn't true. But in the second place, putting your money in a home is not the best way to grow that money. So that would not be a very good explanation for this anyway. The correct explanation, I think, is just that groups differ in their ability to save money. And so if a black person finds themselves with a whole lot of money, the chances that they'll be able to save and hold on to that and their children will be able to, such that it then gets to the grandchildren, is significantly lower. Now, in terms of how inheritance interacts with racial gaps in wealth, we can see here that, in fact, among people that have no inheritance whatsoever, white and black people still differ in wealth by a factor of 5.5. The vast majority of the gap is still there if you totally remove inheritance from the equation. Now, I've been talking so far, though, as if the connection between wealth or income in one generation to the next, that's causal in a way that I don't think it is. I think it's primarily explained by genes. I'm going to take some data from this paper on the heritability of lifetime income. The paper is actually about some stuff in Finland, which we're going to ignore, but it has a cool table at the end summarizing data from the United States on the heritability of income. And what we see is that in the first place, that genetic differences between people explains about 41% of the differences in income between people. But perhaps more importantly for our conversation, the shared family environment explains 9% of the variation. And what that means is that the vast majority of why it is that parents and offspring correlate in terms of how economically successful they are is because of genes. The family environment makes a contribution to that, but it's very small compared to the contribution that genes make to that correlation. And you might say, okay, 9% is 9%, but that's not nothing. But in fact, I want to say that 9% is not accounted for by parental income. It's accounted for by some other aspect of the family environment. And there are many studies getting at this. There have been multiple studies showing that in adoptive families, parental income is not related to offspring income. There have been studies showing that, for instance, families who had their wealth destroyed randomly during the Civil War did not end up any poorer a couple generations later. The same thing is true of lottery winners and even slaves. So there's research comparing the descendants of free blacks and black slaves in the United States, and there was indeed a gap in things like economic occupational status and literacy rates between these groups, but it took about 2 generations for even a gap that profound to go away. And so what all of this points to is that it's just very unlikely that you don't have much money, assuming you live in a first world country like the United States, but it's very unlikely that the reason that you don't have much money is because your grandparents didn't have much money. And so to just summarize this section really quickly, again, the correlation between grandparent and grandchild wealth is very weak among African Americans. The racial gap in wealth is still largely present among people with no inheritance. The correlation between parental and offspring economic success is mostly due to genes, and parental income has little if any causal effect on offspring income. And so given all of this, I don't think that we want to be explaining current racial differences in wealth or poverty with reference to the economic success of previous generations. And actually, as I was saying that, I thought to myself, there's a piece of data that I really should add, which is a conclusion which comes from a report ultimately by Pew, who sponsored it. It's entitled Upward Intergenerational Economic Mobility in the United States. And it looked at how IQ test data interacted with economic mobility, and it finds that, quote, the key finding is that measures of human capital during adolescence, particularly test scores, can virtually explain the entire black-white upper economic mobility gap. So that the entire reason why it is that there are economic differences in life outcomes comparing poor white and poor black people is just because of these test score differences. And that's going to be a reoccurring theme throughout this video, that a lot of these things that some people, including Hunter, think are attributable to racism are actually going to be attributable to group differences in psychology and behavior. Anyway, Hunter goes on to make some claims about discrimination in the application process and the ability to get a job. And so let's listen to that.
Right. If you're living in poverty, it's probably really important that you go out and get a job. But there are issues with that as well, that if you have a black sounding name, you're less likely to get callbacks on your job resumes. So there's all kinds of systemic issues and biases that exist that are holding black people back.
So this is a pretty stock argument. The fellow that Hunter was debating with made the point that people that have very ethnically singling names are probably people who come from a family that puts a lot of value in signaling that they're part of the out group, that they're not like everyone else, and that can be a signal for certain bad attitudes that you don't want in your employees. That seemed to me like a reasonable hypothesis, but Hunter didn't want to seriously consider it because it wasn't based on any specific data. But let's talk about the data. So in the first place, so meta-analytically, and a meta-analysis is just a study that combines a bunch of different studies to produce an aggregated single effect or statistic. And meta-analytically, it is true that very black-sounding names get about 36% fewer callbacks than do very white-sounding names. It should be noted from the get-go that lots of black people don't actually have names that strongly signal their ethnicity, so it's not clear. And so the average black person will not have a 30% lesser chance of getting a callback than the average white person. But if we're just talking about people with somewhat unusual names, it's interesting to see what that translates into, looking at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on how many applications it normally takes to get a job. And what it comes down to is that, generally speaking, a white person will have to send in 18 applications to get a job, and a black person will have to send in 24 or 6 more. And that may add, a couple days to a job search. And so it's not a tremendously profound effect, but it's not nothing either. Or it wouldn't be if the study design made any sense. It doesn't. So there's a base problem, and then there's a way that we made the problem much worse. So the base problem is this. We can see here, a threshold, just a line over two normal distributions, black and white. And there are lots of traits that black and white people differ in that predict job performance, things like intelligence, impulsivity, etc. And you might think that if you have some threshold, which is on a job resume, something like a degree or a certain amount of work experience, then you must pass a certain basic level of those traits in order to have that qualification. And that may very well be true, but what we can see is that on average, the white mean will still be much greater than the black mean in whatever the trait is. And as a result, the average job performance will be much greater in the white case than the black case. It's a slightly abstract point. You may want to pause the video and just look at the graph for a minute if you don't get it. I'm sure it'll click. It's not that complicated. But then we make things much worse if we have affirmative action, which we do, because now the black requirement is lower than the white requirement. And so even if there were no racial differences in any ability related to job performance, if you have lower requirements for blacks than whites to get the same qualifications, then of course it will then be true that given any qualification, the white job performance will be higher than the black job performance. And so because of that, it is perfectly fair to have some degree of bias in favor of white applicants over black applicants who have the same qualifications. And we're going to see in a little bit a more refined take on how much of a bias there is, because of course, this all could be true, but the bias could be well in excess of what is justified by group differences in job performance. And so we're going to look at that in a minute. But first, I want to make more concrete and more empirical rather than abstract and theoretical this idea that given the same qualifications, there are significant racial differences in job-related ability. And to do that, I'm going to firstly be looking at this data from the National Center of Education Statistics on so-called literacy. Now, the literacy is defined in a funny way here. It's defined as, quote, an individual's ability to read, write, and speak in English and compute and solve problems at levels of proficiency necessary to function on the job and in society, to achieve one's goals, and to develop one's knowledge and potential. And this is very much geared towards abilities that you might actually have to utilize in a workplace. And they looked at three broad sorts of abilities. The first was prose literacy, or the knowledge and skills needed to understand and use information from texts. And what we can see is that at every level of education, the white score on prose was significantly higher than that of any other ethnic group, and that in fact, in many cases, the white score at a given level of education was higher than the black score when the black score comes from an even higher level of education. And so, just for example, you look at high school diploma, and that's 278 for whites, whereas for blacks it goes 242 for the high school diploma, 267 of some college, and 276 with a 2-year degree. We don't get to the white high school level until we get to the 4-year degree for blacks. And so, of course, if the job involves interpreting any kind of, or reading any kind of text and getting information from text, you're going to want to hire the white applicant over the black applicant, even if the black applicant had a bit more education than the white applicant. And to give you an idea of what this means in the most concrete terms possible, again, using information from the same document, we find that the black high school score and the white high school score are different enough so as to predict that the white high school graduate could, but the black high school graduate could not do a thing like locate 2 features of information in a sports article or interpret instructions from an appliance warranty. So these differences are quite significant. In the case of comparing a white and black person with a 4-year degree, the differences are such that the white person could and the black person could not read a news article and identify a sentence that provides interpretation of a situation, or read lengthy articles to identify 2 behaviors that meet a stated condition, or state in writing an argument made in a lengthy newspaper article. Moving on from prose, we look at the same pattern of findings with regards to document knowledge, and we're going to see what that means right here, where the white high school graduate could, but the black high school graduate could not, locate eligibility from a table of employee benefits or identify and enter background information on applications for Social Security cards. And the white college graduate could, but the black college graduate could not, use a sign-out sheet to respond to a call about a resident, or use a bus schedule to determine the appropriate bus for a given set of conditions. This sort of data also, by the way, if you've never looked at this kind of data on the average cognitive ability of a person, it really drives home the fact that there are a lot of very stupid people in the world. And finally, we get to quantitative ability, where here, let's just pause and note that the black graduate degree is at 285, and the white person who has gone to some college but hasn't even got a 2-year degree is at 304. That's a profound difference. If a job involves any kind of numbers, the degree to which discrimination is fair is actually quite significant. If you need someone to do the kind of math ability that would be involved in determining the difference in price between tickets for 2 shows or calculate the total cost of purchase from an order form, then you're going to want to hire the white high school graduate and not the black, or in the case of comparing college graduates, the white graduate will be able to and the black graduate will not be able to do something like using a calculator to determine the discount from an old bill if paid within 10 days, or plan travel arrangements for meeting using a flighting schedule, or determine the correct change using information in a menu. And if we look at a more abstract score like an IQ test, we find that, for instance, in 1980, a black person with 4 years of college behind them was at the 49.7th percentile of IQ. So just virtually average in terms of the total IQ distribution, whereas the white with that degree would be the 80th percentile. Again, quite profound differences. And even given current hiring standards, these differences manifest within occupations. We can see here there are profound IQ differences between groups, even when looking at people who all have the same kind of job. Now, before I promised that we were going to look at some way of getting at whether or not the bias manifested by employers is in line with what would actually be fair. And the way we're going to do that is by looking at group differences in actual job performance among people who work the same job at the same organization. Because if it were true that black people were being required to meet an unfair standard in order to get hired at a given place, whereas the standards were much lower for white people, then of course, once they get in those jobs, their job performance should be significantly higher than that of the white employees. Now, I know that there are people who will worry about the measure of job performance because they've bought into this myth of white racism, and so I will note just in passing that for all of these different measures, the group difference is actually greatest on the objective measure of job performance and is lesser in the case of a subjective measure. And a subjective measure, for those that aren't familiar with measures of job performance, would be something like a boss giving a rating of job performance. But those ones are the ones that give the smallest racial differences. And so there's not evidence that they are biased in a anti-black direction. If anything, there's evidence here that they're biased in a pro-black direction. But anyway, just to get to the punchline, there is a difference in job performance among people who are working the same job at the same organization, such that the black people on average score about 1/4 of a standard deviation lower than the white people in job performance. And so what that means, obviously, is that the standards actually are not high enough yet in hiring practices if we're trying to be fair and give someone a job based on how well we can rationally expect them to perform that job. Now, I should also note that if we're talking about the ability to get a job, and so we're implicitly talking to some degree about an employment gap between black and white people, the idea that that is due to discrimination is a funny idea, since the black-white gap in unemployment did not exist until the middle of the 20th century. And presumably, there was more bias against black people back when there was no gap. I should also mention this study, which is of hiring at a police department, an organization which is often accused of racial bias in a variety of respects, including hiring decisions. And unlike the vast majority of studies on hiring, in this context, there was data on the personality profile and the intelligence of the applicants. And what was found was that once that was controlled for, race was not related to someone's chance of being hired. I also want to note something, a little quote from a book called Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, which is by Walter Williams, a black economist who I think died a few years ago, although I might be wrong about that, but I think I remember reading that in the news. But in any case, the reason why I'm quoting from this book is because this particular document of research from the government back in the day hasn't been put online, or if it has, I haven't been able to find it. But in any case, he notes that during 1979 to 1980, the National Bureau of Economic Research conducted a survey in the ghettos of Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Only a minority of respondents were employed, yet almost as many said it was easy or fairly easy to get a job as a laborer as said it was difficult or impossible. And 71% said it was fairly easy to get a minimum wage job. And so you read that, and I think the obvious interpretation, right, is that racism is not the reason that poor black people have a higher rate of unemployment. It just has to do with preferences, behavior, and psychology. Now, of course, you might think, well, that's employment, but these studies about biases in hiring also affect your ability to get promoted and therefore income. And so let's talk about income as separate from unemployment. And I'm happy to do so because we can see from this paper, and this paper is a very good paper. It makes a very important point by comparing models 1 and 2 from this regression chart. So model 1 is calculating the wage gap between black and white male workers after controlling for years of school and work experience, mother's education, age, where they live, whether or not they're married, and the number of children they have. And controlling for all that stuff, black men still only make 81% as much as white men do. But if you add cognitive ability to that model, suddenly now black men make 108% as much as white men do. So that now there's a gap in favor of the black male. And there's also this nice column telling us the percentage of the wage gap explained by each variable. And what we see is that intelligence, which is a variable that most social scientists are, for political reasons, scared to even touch, explains more of the gap than any of these other variables. And it's worth noting that this has been replicated before. So in this paper, using data from the General Social Survey, looking from 1974 to 2000, it found, and actually before I tell you what it found, I want to say that it's a bit misleading to call this IQ. So this is a super simple measure of cognitive ability. It's literally a 10-word vocabulary test. But it found that adding a 10-word vocabulary test reduced the racial gap in earnings to statistical insignificance. So to sum up some of the points that I've made on income and employment, employers are rational to prefer white applicants because even controlling for qualifications, white work performance is expected to be higher. The standards of employers are actually biased in favor of blacks in terms of the expected job performance, and controlling for psychological variables eliminates racial gaps in income and the probability of being hired. Hunter goes on to make some very standard false claims about education funding in the United States, so let's listen to that.
Okay, first of all, they don't have as many opportunities in schools. If we're going to talk about that, again, your schools are funded by your tax dollars. So if you're living in poverty, you also likely have shittier schools because they're not receiving as much funding.
So there are a few things to say. Firstly, I want to note that a lot of leftists online for some reason, and I do think it's specific online. I've read a fair number of books about racial bias by academics and the like, and I don't see this appearing in the more professional literature, but someone told some Twitch streamer at some point that in the modern era, schools are overwhelmingly funded by property taxes. Hunter didn't directly say that. He just said, quote, your taxes. And of course, schools are paid for by taxes. But I do want to make it clear, in case he had that in mind, that property taxes cover about a third of the coverage of schools. This is something I know Destiny likes to say a lot, and I literally have no idea why. It's weird because this was true like 100 years ago, that more of the funding came from local property taxes, and then liberals changed that system, and I guess someone hasn't told someone online that. But anyway, let's talk about education funding by race. And Hunter didn't cite a specific source, so I'm going to use the one most often cited by liberals and shit on it. So there's this report that finds non-white school districts get $23 billion less than white school districts. And this has been cited by NPR and Vox and all of the big idiot organizations. And it's based on a very simple bullshit trick. So what they're doing is they're comparing funding in school districts that are 75% or more non-white to funding in school districts that are 75% or more white. And the consequence of that, of course, is to exclude lots of school districts. And there have been analyses for decades that actually include all of the school districts, and they find the same thing. So this is one that covers years from 1972 to 1997. And what do you know? In 1972, the spending per pupil was 2% higher for whites. Then in 1982, it was 1% lower for whites. Then in 1992, it was 3% lower for whites. We can look at other things beyond funding. How about the ratio of teachers to students? And we find, again, there was a 1% gap favoring white people in 72, then a 4% gap favoring non-white people in 1982, and in 92 that had grown to a 5% gap. We can also divide the districts, as you can see, into bins of 0 to 10% non-white, 10 to 50, 50 to 90, 90 plus. And what we find is that there's not much of a difference in terms of experience, but in more heavily minority schools, you tend to see more teachers with graduate degrees and fewer teachers with certifications. You tend to see more teachers that are working full time. And again, we see they're getting paid more. And it is true that they don't like the schools as much. I mean, that's something you can note. They say that they're more likely to say that they wouldn't want to teach again in the future, despite the better classroom size ratios and pay and all those. And it's because of the students. Well, let's be honest. But anyway, just for the sake of updating this data somewhat, we can look at this report from the Heritage Foundation by Jason Richwine. What we find is that there's a 1% funding gap in favor of black kids, 3 to 4% gap against Hispanic and Asian kids. And all these numbers are pretty damn close. I'm not, mad about the 1% gap in favor of black kids. I'm not upset about the 3% gap disfavoring Asian kids. It's all pretty gosh darn close. Oh, and I guess I should note I'm talking about the column that's adjusted for cost of living. before adjusting for cost of living, all the kids are better funded than white kids are. Anyway, I don't really think this needs any summary slide. This is just not true, right? The funding is not lower for black students. That's just something that people make up. So moving on now, we're going to talk a bunch about bias in the criminal justice system. Hunter says a bunch of wild shit. Let's just start it off with a claim he makes about disproportionate experience of violence by the police.
Higher encounters with police means a higher likelihood of being victimized by police brutality, which is a fact supported by statistics collected on police violence.
So there is some research which supports the idea that police officers are more likely to use violence when dealing with black people, but the reason the data supports that is because studies saying that are more likely to get published than studies not saying that. And so we can look at this meta-analysis done on this topic, and we see that in the first place it replicates the normal finding that across 42 studies, there's a mean effect size of 0.31, pointing in the direction of more force being used on black suspects, even after controlling for things like offense seriousness and is there a weapon and are they resisting arrest and all of these sorts of things which would fairly lead to a change in the probability of force being used. Now, before I noted that this effect is due to publication bias. They do a test for publication bias, and it's kind of funny how they describe it in the text. They say, the quote, "These results demonstrate that publication bias does not appear to be present for 8 of the 12 significant variables." I think it's just funny that they don't name which ones were changed and which ones weren't. But in fact, we can look, and after adjusting for the effect of publication bias, using a trim and fill method, and if you're unaware, without getting into too much detail, this is basically a method based on the fact that when all the studies are being published, there should be a certain distribution that changes in a predictable way as study precision increases. It should kind of symmetrically move towards a center point, and by looking at the actual distribution, you can tell where studies were left out and then put them back in. It's a pretty standard method for detecting and correcting for publication bias. There is research suggesting that it doesn't correct enough, but that's not going to be an issue here because already, as we can see, the mean effect size is reduced to statistical insignificance and practical insignificance. It's worth saying the effect size is 0.01, and the confidence interval runs from negative 0.07 to positive 0.08. And I should also note, of course, that black people are significantly less likely than white people are to be killed by police relative to the rate at which they kill or seriously assault police officers, which is the context in which you would think police using that kind of violence would be most clearly justified. Hunter next goes on to make some pretty stock arguments about bias in arrest rates. Let's listen to that.
According to Pew Research Center, in 2017, there were 1,549 black prisoners for every 100,000 black adults, nearly 6 times the imprisonment rate for whites. A 2020 ACLU report found that black people were much more likely to be arrested for marijuana usage, despite the fact that whites and blacks have consistently been shown to use the drug at the same rate.
So the first thing to say is that pertaining to arrest rates in general, black people are arrested in concordance with the rate at which they are reported to police as suspects of crimes. Many studies have shown this. This table summarizes the results of 4 such studies, and let's look at a chart from one in particular. And we can see that these numbers are roughly equal with each other, even in the case of drug offenses, because oftentimes people who get arrested for drugs because someone calls the police on them for obviously using drugs in a problematic way, and that's why the incident reports number would correspond, even though it's a victimless crime. Now, he talked about the finding that black and white people use weed at the same rate, but the arrest rates aren't the same. And there are 2 things to say about that. So firstly, it's not true that they use the drug at the same rate. The studies that say that are based on self-report data. There are many studies showing that self-report data is not equally valid across races for drug use, or for almost anything for that matter. So I just picked one study at random. And so what we can see is that comparing, in the case of marijuana, asking someone if they've smoked marijuana to a biological test for the drug, the concordance rate in the whites in this particular sample was 100%. Among African Americans, it was 87%. They were way more likely. They were significantly more likely to lie about having used marijuana. The same thing was true of cocaine. And again, that's a widely replicated finding that liberals still make this argument based just on self-report data. It shows how serious they are. And also, the person who he's debating with notes this. And again, it's something he said, which is true, but he didn't have sort of data to back it up. And what he said is that black people were using drugs in more risky ways than white people were. And we can see here, and again, this is something that also has been shown multiple times in the research. Picked one study as a representative. And it says African Americans, compared to white drug users, were twice as likely to buy outdoors, 3 times more likely to buy from a stranger, and significantly more likely to buy away from their homes. And so the self-report data is not valid. If the self-report data shows they use them at the same rate, and black people are more likely to lie and falsely claim they haven't used the drug, then what that actually means is that to some degree black people are using the drug more than white people, and on top of that, they're using it in a more risky way. And so the drug arrest rates are not evidence of systemic racism, at least in the sense that black people are being treated unfair. It is true, of course, that there's a disparate outcome here, but the disparate outcome is not racist in the traditional sense of the term. And I also want to return to this theme that what's actually going on here is racial differences in behavior and psychology are explaining the outcomes. So this is a study which controlled for IQ and impulsivity and found that after doing that, race and parental socioeconomic status, just thought I'd note that it'll become somewhat relevant later, but neither race nor parental socioeconomic status were significantly related to whether or not someone would be arrested after controlling for these psychological variables and past criminality. Similarly, this study finds that just controlling for age, IQ, and a survey that just asked people about how generally violent they've been in their life, that doing that reduced to statistical insignificance the racial difference in the probability of being arrested, and the same thing with the probability for being incarcerated. And so we see once again that if you know what variables to look for, it's pretty easy to make these differences go away. So clearly, there's no significant evidence of bias in the case of arrest rates, and I think I'm going to give up on making those little summary slides, just because this video is taking long enough as it is. Let's next listen to Hunter say some things about the rate at which police stop people by race.
In 2013, a federal judge ruled stop and frisk, an aspect of the tough on crime approach, was unconstitutional. The judge found that the police department resorted to a policy of indirect racial profiling as it increased the number of stops in minority communities. That has led to officers routinely stopping blacks and Hispanics who would not have been stopped if they were white. According to an in-depth 2020 Nature study, which examined nearly 100 million traffic stops across the country, black drivers were less likely to be stopped after sunset when they were in a veil of darkness, masking one's race, which suggests bias in stop decisions.
All right, so we brought up two different kinds of evidence. The first had to do with stop and frisk. It is true that the stop and frisk program led to black people being stopped more often than white people, but of course, from the same perspective, we have to next ask, to what degree is that difference in stop rate explained by differences in the probability of doing something that warrants arrest? And so to answer that question, let's look at this paper analyzing 10 years worth of data on the program. And initially what we see, right, is that there's this huge difference in the stops, in the stop rate, which they're calling police pressure, but that the hit rate or arrest per stop rate is very close to the same, although there is a difference, but it's quite close, especially compared to the difference in police pressure. So right off the bat, we can say that even though it is true that the arrest rate is a little lower per stop among African Americans, and so what that might mean is that they are stopping African Americans with a lower bar of evidence than they are for white Americans, so excessively stopping them. Even if that was true, the vast majority of the difference in stop rate is still accounted for by the actual difference in the rate at which they're doing things which warrant arrest. But the issue with that is that different precincts in New York have different norms about how quickly you are to arrest someone, depending on sort of the background level of crime in that area. And for people within that precinct, this applies to you whether you're white or black. And so what this paper finds is that, quote, after accounting for the fact that different precincts have different baseline rates of arrest conditional on search, African Americans are no longer less likely to be arrested conditional on being stopped. Actually, they're a little more likely to be arrested. And so the evidence of an anti-black bias completely disappears. Now, he also brought up the veil of darkness test, referring to this paper from 2020. There's a lot that you can say about this. So one thing I want to say is that I don't think anyone other than the researchers actually knows the sample size for the veil of darkness test. So they say in their paper that they collected data on 221 million stops, but that they threw a bunch of it out because the race of the driver was not recorded, things like that, missing data basically, and they only wanted certain years of data. And so that limited their analysis to 95 million stops from 21 state agencies and 35 local police departments. But the issue is that this paper does multiple sorts of analyses, and in the case of the veil of darkness test, they restricted the analysis to two 60-day windows centered on the beginning and end of daylight savings time. My best read of the paper is that means that the sample size for the veil of darkness test was much lesser than was the sample size for the other analyses done in the paper, which don't rely on that window. They also removed certain times of the day. And so again, we don't really know exactly how big it was. It's safe to say that it was probably in the tens of millions, but we don't know how many tens of millions. In any case, they found that there was a 3% decline, 3 percentage point decline in the rate of stopping black drivers after the sun went down. Now, they note that results could be skewed if race-specific driving behaviors are related more to lighting than daytime, leading the test to suggest discrimination where there is none. But on the other hand, artificial lighting could weaken the relationship between sunlight and visibility. So it might be that actually you can see the race of the person at night. And there are some crimes that are more easily visible at night, such as having a broken taillight, which could inflate the African American arrest rate at night and thus actually hide a degree of bias. Their example is taillights. The example I like to bring up sometimes is going in the other direction, which is things like wearing a seatbelt or having an expired registration tag. There are actually cities that are trying to stop people from being pulled over for those offenses because of the African American overrepresentation in people committing those crimes. And obviously that could lead to a greater arrest rate during the day. They also, something they don't mention, I think somewhat surprisingly, is suspects. We saw before that black arrest rates correspond very well to the suspect rate, and black people are massively overrepresented among suspects. And so that's obviously going to lead to a greater degree of being pulled over during the day. Now, a lot of people that are pulled over are not suspects. That's not going to be a huge effect. But again, these little kind of causes can contribute a fair amount when we're talking about a 3 percentage point difference to begin with. But also this hasn't replicated well. So there's this very recent study here, which actually tells us the sample size they had specifically for the Veil of Darkness test, which is nice of them. It's a little less than 20 million. Again, it's not clear to me if that's lesser or greater than the sample size the other study had for the Veil of Darkness test. And what it found is that, quote, the proportion of stopped black drivers in comparison with the black county population were lower during daylight than during darkness. So this is the opposite finding. And in fact, if you're familiar with this line of research, there have been conflicting findings in the Veil of Darkness research literature going back for many years now. I mean, the first instance of this research actually found evidence of no bias. And there have been papers going back and forth for many years, and now they're going back and forth with samples in the tens of millions. It's really not clear what the sort of national averages, because apparently there are some areas where there's no difference. There are some areas where during the daylight black people are arrested more, and there are some areas where they're arrested less during the daylight. And as I say, sample sizes in the tens of millions with lots of states in them are now producing conflicting results, and so it is hard to say what the average is. But again, this isn't a very good test of discrimination anyway, because there are lots of alternative explanations. And then on top of all of that, even if the police were seeing black people and using it as a heuristic to increase by 3 percentage points the probability of them pulling someone over, that could be totally proper if that reflects differences in the probability that they're doing something which is worth pulling them over for. Now, the original paper, that 100 million so-called sample size paper, makes an argument in response to this having to do with something called the threshold test. Hunter didn't bring that up, so I'm not going to get into that. I'll link in the description, though, a video that I did recently where I explained why the threshold test is silly, if anyone's interested and wants to understand why that's not a valid argument either. And finally, I want to note that studies that do actually directly attempt to measure the behavior of people make the gap in stop rates by race go away. So, for example, this is probably the most prominent example of this kind of thing. This study describes a situation in which they actually just installed cameras to directly see the degree to which different groups were speeding. And they found that, quote, the proportion of speeding drivers who were identified as black mirrored the proportion of black drivers stopped by police. So again, stop and frisk is not evidence of bias. The Veil of Darkness test is not a proper measure of discrimination. And then on top of that, there are mixed findings in the literature, even when we're talking about very large sample studies. And when you actually directly measure the behavior of the people involved, the racial difference in stop rates goes away. So there's not good reason to think that there's racial bias in stop rates. All right, so next, Hunter cherry-picks some data regarding sentencing and the death penalty and that kind of thing. And to be fair, I don't know that he's the one who cherry-picked it. It could be that whoever does his thinking for him is the person who cherry-picked it. But in either case, let's listen to him do this and then explain why it's wrong.
A 2014 study looked at 33 years of data, and they found that after adjusting for variables such as the number of victims and brutality of the crimes, jurors in Washington state were 4.5 times more likely to impose the death penalty on black defendants accused of aggravated murder than on white ones. According to a 2017 U.S. Sentencing Commission report, black male offenders receive sentences on average 19.1% longer than similarly situated white male offenders.
Okay, so we got two research lines to deal with, one about the death penalty in particular and the other about sentencing length in general. So I'm pretty sure this is the paper that he's referring to about the death penalty in Washington state. It covers the right year span and the effect size is correct 4.5 times. So there are a few things that can be said about this paper. Firstly, the asterisk indicates a significant finding at a level of 10%. This means that the p-value of the finding, which refers to the probability of an effect size or greater being observed due to sampling error given a lack of effect, in the total population. That p-value was between 0.05 and 0.1. What we can see empirically is that p-values of 0.05 have a replication rate of about 30%, which is why a lot of social scientists argue that we need to change the standard convention, which is to call something significant at 0.05 to a lower p-value, because lower p-values lead to a higher probability of replication. This paper isn't even using the standard in social science, it's using an even less rigorous standard at 10%, and so we should not take it seriously. I'm just, based on the statistics alone, the probability that it will replicate is less than half, so it's shit. And then on top of that, these people like Hunter, this is such a stupid approach to social science. This idea is like a racism of the gap. If you look at the pseudo R-squared statistic, it's 0.215. What does that mean? That means that 22% of the variance in terms of who does and does not get the death penalty was explained by these variables. So the vast majority of the difference was not captured by any of the variables measured, including race. And given that, it is totally asinine to think that, well, then clearly it must be racism. We haven't even measured the variables that account for most of why it is some people do and do not get the death penalty. Obviously, in this sample of, criminals that it is plausible they could get the death penalty to begin with. Since we know that we're missing some of the main determinants, it's very silly to think that it must be racism. But anyway, this, in fact, does not replicate well, just in the sense that, we can start here. This is a well-known paper in the literature, I think from 1981, if I remember right, and it summarizes a bunch of the research that was done up to that point. We're focused here on the death penalty, so the capital sentencing, and what we see is that there were 7 studies that were found in this, which provided support for a discrimination hypothesis, 4 that provided mixed evidence one way or the other, and then 6 that found no evidence. So a pretty mixed set of findings, and in fact, this paper contributes another finding that does not support a discrimination hypothesis. It goes on to note that the rate of execution per homicide offender is actually, if anything, lower among black people. We can look at this paper, going more recently, looking at data in Tennessee from 1977 to 2006, and they find that, quote, once significant controls are introduced, neither the race of the defendant nor that of the victim is a significant predictor of prosecutors' decision to seek the death penalty, nor is the race of the victim a significant predictor of the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. The defendant's race is a significant, albeit weak, predictor of jury behavior, but only because white defendants are more likely to be sentenced to death. We can look at this study on Pennsylvania from 2000 to 2010. It finds that we do not find that black defendants or black defendants who kill white victims specifically are more likely to have the death penalty sought or imposed. They do note that they find that those who kill white victims regardless of defendant race are more likely to receive the death penalty. But we should, of course, note that most murder is contained within a single race, so that's actually going to disproportionately negatively impact white people. And then they go on to say that they find that black defendants and blacks who killed black victims were more likely to have death filings retracted by prosecutors. So once again, another study suggesting, if anything, a pro-black bias. And don't get me wrong, there are other studies that also do evidence bias. Up to this point, the point that I'm trying to make is that I think it is ignorant or dishonest to point to a single study in this literature when the findings are so mixed, as if that tells us much of anything. But the most important point I want to make has to do with this paper looking at sentences in Georgia, because they included a variable which, to my knowledge, no other study has. They conducted an index of, quote, dangerousness, which was a function of IQ and antisocial personality. So these sort of psychological variables that I keep saying actually explain these differences. And what they found was that they binned people by their score on this dangerousness index. Low, low intermediate, high danger. And as it turns out that within each category, what we see, right, except for high, where virtually everyone who scored high in the dangerous index was given the death penalty. But when looking at everyone who scored at a more modest level, there was a bias in favor of black people, such that they were less likely than white people who scored equally on these measures of IQ and antisocial personality to be convicted and sentenced to death. And so, again, once you control for the right sorts of variables, these gaps either go away or they flip so that they now no longer favor white people. Now let's talk about sentencing generally. The first thing I want to do is make the same kind of point. Pointing to a single study in this literature is either ignorant or misleading. I've assembled here a list of 32 studies that looked at racial bias in sentencing. There were 7 effect sizes which indicated an anti-black bias, 23 that were non-significant, and 2 that indicated a pro-black bias. And so this is a kind of literature that's very easy to cherry pick. You could easily cite multiple studies in a misleading way. Now, what you want to do when you have lots of conflicting empirical research results is meta-analyze them, as this paper did. And what do you know? Controlling for offensive severity and priors, race was no longer a significant predictor of sentence length. And this was the result of combining data from, I think, 45 studies. And then finally, just as in the case of other things we've looked at, we got to look at the study that actually measures psychological variables. And what we find is that defendant's IQ is a significant predictor of sentence length, and that after controlling for that, defendant's race is no longer a significant predictor. Well, after controlling for that and, other standard things included in these studies like the crime and was the victim hurt, etc. But that after controlling for all of these things, including the psychology, race is no longer a significant predictor of sentence length. So yeah, there's mixed findings for the death penalty and for sentence length. But if you look at those studies which actually control for psychology, there aren't a lot done, but the ones that are done find that there is either no difference or a difference that favors black people. And so we should not conclude on the basis of this research that there is an anti-black bias. So the next thing Hunter gets wrong is the relationship between poverty and crime, and let's take a listen to that. And this is going to be a bit of a longer clip. A few things he said about it kind of stitched together.
When we're talking about violent crime, this is a downstream effect of poverty, and poverty is a result of previous historical racist policies. According to a research paper published by Park Place economist, there's a direct correlation between poverty and violent crime rates. I know, I already see people in the chat saying 1350. Sustained economic growth projects, reducing unemployment, progressive taxes, increasing benefits to the poor, and increasing jobs to fight violent crimes are all valid ways at reducing poverty and fighting violent crime. So this means that because of the federal government's redlining, the already poorer black neighborhoods inevitably have a higher crime rate as well.
But poverty does not cause the crime. That's what
we can't prove causation for virtually anything. Okay, so when you have high rates of crime, no, this is like a known sociological fact. Okay, that when you have higher rates of poverty, it contributes to more crime, which then contributes to more poverty, and it becomes a vicious cycle.
I believe he's saying if poverty is such an issue, why do high-class black areas still have higher crime than lower-class white areas?
First of all, I would love to see a statistic on that because I don't believe that's true. Second of all, this is demonstrated even with when white Italians, for example, first immigrated to the country. They lived in poor areas and they had higher crime rates at the time. Poverty is always heavily correlated with crime rates.
So to begin with, there is, of course, a correlation between poverty and crime. Poor people are more likely to commit crime. My view on that is because poor people are more likely to be aggressive, impulsive, and unintelligent. At least in the first world, where poverty normally doesn't lead to that desperate of material conditions. So let's look at some literature which casts doubt on the causal link between poverty and crime. The first couple studies will come from Scandinavia. It's true that Scandinavia is different than America, but in Scandinavia, just as in America, poor people are many times more likely to commit violent crime and drug abuse and that sort of thing. These studies control for so-called unobserved family characteristics by asking the question, is it true that the sibling who grows up when the family is poor is more likely to become a criminal than the sibling who grew up when the family was not poor? And they find that, quote, children of parents in the lowest income quintile experienced a 7-fold increased hazard rate of being convicted of violent criminality compared to their peers in the highest quintile. This association was entirely accounted for by unobserved family risk factors. And similar pattern of effects was found for substance misuse. We see a replication of this in another country. They find that, quote, in this Finnish cohort study of 650,000 individuals, we initially found that increased family income was associated with lower risks of psychiatric disorders, substance misuse, and arrest for violent crime. However, once we compared siblings who grew up in the same household but were exposed to varying income levels at specific ages, that association was no longer present. Associations between family income and subsequent psychiatric disorders, substance misuse, and violent crime arrest are therefore explained by shared familial risks and were not consistent with a causal interpretation. And then we want to look at this study from Sweden on neighborhood deprivation, and we see here that the relationship between neighborhood deprivation and violent crime and substance misuse went away once you did this within sibling analysis. Now, America is different, as I said, but what this shows is that large correlations between poverty and crime are produced in countries around the world, and that at least sometimes those correlations are not causal in the slightest. And so that should make us much more skeptical of the correlation seen in the United States. One easy way to test this is to look at recessions, because, again, my view is that poor people tend to be less intelligent and more impulsive and more aggressive, and so they tend to commit more crime. But during recessions, everyone becomes poor, but everyone does not become dumber and more aggressive and more impulsive all of a sudden. And we can see for property crime, recessions sometimes happen while crime is going up, while it's going down, while it's staying still. There's really no effect that is evident, and the same is true of violent crime. Now, Hunter talked about the Italians, and so I want to look at actual crime data on Italians from the early 20th century. And what we find is that in 1904, Italian Americans were overrepresented among those committing major offenses. They were 67% more likely, after you control for age, to be convicted of a major offense. But this is not very much like the situation with blacks and whites. For one thing, black people have been here, longer than the Italians already, but also, as Hunter noted earlier, the difference between blacks and whites is something like a factor of 6. And so the Italian native white difference was much smaller even back then. Now, importantly, what happened here is not that these, again, there's a correlation between poverty and crime. So it did not happen that these poor crime-committing Italians assimilated and then stopped committing crime once they got wealthy. Rather, what happened is they just left. So we can look at this paper on economic assimilation during the age of mass migration, and what we see is that among Italians who didn't go back to Italy, they were richer than average in the first generation of immigrants here. And in fact, this paper shows that they were not poor even if in the first 5 years. A lot of people don't understand this, that what happened to European ethnic groups in the United States in the early 20th century is that a bunch of them came here, and then for the ones that succeeded in America, they stayed, and those who did not went back to Europe. There were some years where over half, I believe, of the Italian immigrants in particular went back to Italy. And so none of this has anything to do with poverty causing crime or getting out of poverty causing a decrease in crime. That's just a total misread of the situation. And finally, let's look at some data on the intersection between race, poverty, and crime. So the first data is going to come from our friends at the Federal Reserve. And what we can see is that, for instance, looking at very poor families living in communities where the median family income percentile is between 0 and 10 relative to the general public. So the bottom 10% of the income distribution, families in those neighborhoods, in the case that they were white, the murder rate, I believe this is per 100,000 if I'm not mistaken, was 8 in the 60s, 5 in the 70s, and less than 1 in the 80s. Whereas for blacks, those numbers were 86 in the 60s, 92 in the 70s, and 117 in the 80s. And that moreover, beginning in the 70s, it was true that even black people in the richest neighborhoods, had a murder rate of 11.2 compared to white people in the poorest neighborhoods of 5.5. We see a similar thing looking at net wealth. Hunter would have you think that, anywhere you look, if you find poor people, you're going to find criminals. But as we can see, that is actually not true of all the races, that poor white people have quite low crime rates, and that relatively affluent black people have quite high crime rates. And so, as has been going on, it's sort of the theme of this video. He's just wrong about literally everything he says about this stuff. Let's next move on to his take on the role that single parenthood plays in all this.
Lastly, you brought up single mothers, which if we're going to talk about, for example, there was a government policy that was put in place that screwed over the black community and led to more single mothers. That is systemic racism. It can come from the Democrats, just like it can come from the Republicans. I just read that black people
it's their own fault.
There's 6 times the imprisonment rate for white people. Okay, this is going to have a negative effect on black families as a whole.
All right, and this is at long last the final thing to talk about. So let's begin by looking at some meta-analyses to get an idea of how big the correlation is between these variables. Here's an old meta-analysis, and what we find is that being from a broken home increases your risk of total delinquency by about 11%, your risk of violent crime by about 4%. So from the outset, we should say that if we're trying to explain something like a 600% gap in murder rate, thinking that broken homes is a big deal seems kind of dumb. And in fact, we should note that in this meta-analysis, they noted that the larger the sample size got, the smaller the effect size was, suggesting a publication bias, and the effect size is probably even weaker than what I just said. We can look at a more modern meta-analysis. It finds the correlation being less than 0.1, and so there is a statistical relationship, but it's very weak to begin with, and there are reasons to think it's not causal. So we can look at this study, which found that there was an initial significant relationship between divorce and young adult crime. However, the effects of divorce disappeared when further path analysis controlled for the effects of social class and father criminality. Now, of course, divorce is a particular kind of broken home, and it might not lead to the traditional single parenthood situation, but it often would, and so I think that it's worth noting, especially since initially we see the same relationship. The people from divorced homes also have higher criminality, and that's not because of the divorce, that's because of background family variables. The next thing to look at is this 2018 paper, which finds that parental arrest coincides with negative outcomes for children, but that the incarceration of a parent may benefit the child. Benefits occur for end-of-year grade exams and school behavioral outcomes, with effects concentrated among young children whose mothers have committed violent crimes or fathers with alcohol or drug offenses, results suggest that parental incarceration changes a child's home environment through the removal of a negative role model. That's something a lot of people don't think about. It may be true that people from really good homes would have been worse off if their parents weren't present. But that doesn't mean that there aren't families where the parents are shitty, such that their presence is actually a net negative with the child. This study indicates maybe they get upset initially when the parent leaves, but even by the end of the single year, they're doing better in life. And this is, in fact, on average, what happens when parents go away, when the reason they're going away is because they're arrested, because the kind of parents that tend to have to leave their kids because they committed a criminal act and got arrested for it, tend to not be that great of parents. And so there's actually some reason to think that the single parenthood rate among black people might decrease their crime rate, because again, these super irresponsible criminal fathers are not going to suddenly become great people just being at home. They're just going to display that and model that behavior for their kids at home, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Finally, last paper I want to bring up in this video. This paper had a bunch of data from the IRS. They did a super lopsided analysis that still kills this narrative. So what we're looking at, firstly, we're only looking at people here whose income rank is in the 25th percentile, so income has been controlled for. And then what we're looking at is the gap in incarceration rate in communities where almost none of the black kids have their father present and communities where almost all of them do. That's not the same thing. You'd think what we would look at, right, is where all the children have their father's presence and where they don't. But in fact, these neighborhoods where all the black kids have their father present, that doesn't tell us as much about the proportion of white kids in those communities that have their fathers present. And so, like I said, a very lopsided analysis, but nonetheless, we see that even in communities where the overwhelming majority of black fathers are present, the majority of the crime gap still remains. And again, I wouldn't even interpret that reduction as being the causal result of single parenthood for reasons I've already explained, using that as a proxy for personality traits and psychology. Anyway, that's the video. I hope I have coherently explained why it is that I think that Hunter was wrong about basically everything. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a comment or a like. If you're a big fan of the channel in general, then you might consider materially supporting it. But in either case, thanks for watching.